Two scriptures, kind of long, both work at some interesting things, I think. I bumped into them this week. Do you remember your earth science classes? Do you remember the one where they took a bar magnet and a piece of paper and they put the bar magnet down and then they got some iron filings and they sprinkled them on top? Do you remember that one and how it all of a sudden the iron filings began to move around? They shook it a little bit and then you saw a pattern emerge and there was an arc around each end of the bar magnet. Do you remember that? I remember that. It was so cool. It looked like magic. If your teacher didn't do that for you, shame on her or him. Well, the teacher probably did show it to you and probably explained this is a magnetic force field. And you thought, whoa, now I can see it because of the iron filings and how they showed me where the field was located. And it was there even though I couldn't see it before, but it's always there. This magnetic force field. Any iron product that enters the force field is going to be affected by it. And later in school, you learned that there were other force fields. You learned how magnetism is related to the force field of electricity, and you learned about the force field of gravity. So when I bumped into these scriptures, I realized that they kind of reminded me of a different kind of force field, a spiritual force field. The prophet Habakkuk warned that the Judeans of the coming danger from the Babylonians who would destroy and take them away into captivity. In so doing, he wrote of the universal dangers of homicidal violence, arrogance, wealth, and pride. There's only one defense against these things that he offers, and it comes in the form of a spiritual force field. Luke tells us of a time when Jesus was talking about the need to forgive people who offend us or who trip us up with their stumbling blocks, and to forgive them not just once, but 7 times a day. The disciples' response was one of alarm, you may remember. They yearned for a spiritual force field that would help them gather the strength like iron filings to live as Jesus taught. Now, these two stories point to a common spiritual force field, which makes a difference in how we deal with each other. It's one of the central ingredients for any people who want to continue the work of Jesus simply, peacefully, and together. Personal conflicts and homicidal violence have been with us for a very long time. They flow like flash floods through history and Scripture. I find it something of a warning to the church that the first act of homicidal violence was between brethren in a fight over worship styles. Think about it. The first murder came between Adam's and Eve's children, Cain and Abel, and it all centered around their worship, their offerings. But violence is the heart of our national story as well. Back in the 80s, H. Rap Brown made a statement that stunned a lot of us when he sang, "Violence is as American as cherry pie." Now, few of us want to admit that, but we remember that in spite of their lofty religious ideals, our forebears practiced homicidal violence against the Native Americans. Did you know that scalping was introduced to America by English colonists? In 1755, God-fearing, I put that in quotes, God-fearing pious Puritans, Pilgrims, and Anglicans of the Boston community set a bounty of 50 pounds sterling for every Native American scalp that was of a male particularly, but how do you know, that was brought in as proof of their having been killed. I read that 50 pounds sterling then, if you were to consider the spending power of it today, it would be about $8,000. It was homicidal violence that our forebears used to fight their revolution. And it was the glories of bombs bursting in air during the battle, which is the focus of our national anthem. And isn't it that same violence that our fireworks that we're going to be experiencing over the weekend is really to call to mind? And it was the good Christians both of that generation and a later generation who enslaved Africans to do their labor and provided for the economic growth of the nation. The history of slavery is drenched in violence from beginning to end. Our history tells us of frontier lawlessness, industrial strife, vigilante torture, execution, mob lynching, race riots, terrorism, political assassinations, bombing. I could go on for a long while. And that doesn't even mention all the wars that have been going on, and I couldn't number those out, and boy, you'd really get bored. And we're still in them. Today, homicidal violence is promoted on television. One study says that by the time a child reaches 18, they will have witnessed over 18,000 murders, countless highly detailed incidents of robbery, arson, bombing, shooting, beatings, forgery, smuggling, torture, rape. And that doesn't begin to compare to the computer and video games. Now, Habakkuk, of course, wouldn't know about virtual violence. He was concerned about real violence. And it seemed that he was fed up with it, as is true of every serious-minded, peace-loving person today. Habakkuk, however, did not resign himself to violence. He had a vision. He saw a way out, a better time, a better day. And he remembers he heard, "If it seems to tarry, wait for it." Perhaps, though, it was Micah who did the better job of describing this vision. "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord," he wrote, "that God may teach us divine ways, and that we may walk in the paths of God. God shall judge between many people, and shall arbitrate between strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. And nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." And Jesus, that is the Jesus of Luke, lamented over Jerusalem 600 years after Habakkuk, because they had not learned the things that make for peace. And now, 2,000 years later, I suspect he would weep over us as well. This brings us then to the gospel reading of the day. Jesus pointed us to a surprising force field whose power may be invisible as magnetism's, but is remarkably stronger. And you've probably figured it out already. I feel certain you have. Just what is this force field? Well, if you looked at the cover, you probably saw it. If you listened to Julie's story, you heard it. That's right. It's faith, trust. A deeply religious man rose in a religious meeting to tell a young man about a young man who had lost his faith. And he went on and on about this is terrible. This guy lost his faith. And he was out sailing with a friend of his, and a storm came up. And the young man said, who had lost his faith, he had drowned. This young man, just think of it. Doesn't that say everything? Isn't the lesson clear? He lost his faith and drowned. And so the man sat down, who was telling the story. After a little while, he stood back up. He said, sort of sheepishly, "Well, to be fully honest, the other man drowned too." A rather common failing, isn't it? The way sometimes we tell things to favors our point of view. But we often think of faith as a good luck charm, something to protect us against harm. But the faith that Jesus was talking about doesn't work that way. It doesn't even work the way Habakkuk thought it would when he said, "If it seems to tarry, wait for it." The waiting, as Jesus would describe faith, is not going to be passive. It's acting with the assumption of its coming peace and wholeness. The faith of which Jesus spoke is more of an action than an object. Faith is not the same thing as belief. It is not a matter of doctrine. It's not professing that what we believe in some statement about God, about the church, about Christ. And it's not just optimism. Faith is a powerful spiritual force. By faith, we make new discoveries for the benefit of humankind. By faith, we build bridges of love and understanding across chasms of prejudice and ignorance. By faith, we express freedom in the face of tyranny. By faith, we forgive those who would cause us to stumble in the path of Christ, not daily, but 7 times a day. And remember how when the disciples heard this, they were alarmed, saying, "Increase our faith." But surprisingly, Jesus didn't seem to be impressed by their plea. Instead, Jesus seemingly, in a way, held up a mirror to them as if to say, "Increase? You think you already have faith? Why, you just don't get it. If you had even a mustard seeds of faith, you could transplant this tree into the lake." The extreme language could suggest just how upset he was that they just didn't get it. I believe we miss the point when we think that faith is something that we can gather together or could measure. Faith isn't something we have, it is something we do. Faith, as Luke's Jesus talks about it, is more like the waitress at your favorite restaurant. When the food comes, you don't say, "Sit down and eat with me. Can I get you a cup of coffee?" to the waitress. No. We expect full service for our money until we are ready to go. Then we might leave a tip, some of us better than others. In a similar way with our practice of faith, when we are doing our jobs as followers of Jesus, we work hard at the job, no matter the treatment we get from the customers. It's a hard job of living in peace with ourselves and with each other. That requires living in a peaceful future right now, in our present relationships, stormy as they may be at times. And it means sticking with it until the Lord returns, or the cows come home, or we die first. My guess is most of us sitting here sit beside our own pool of tears. We have been badly hurt by someone, and maybe someone here. Just think of it. Have you been betrayed, lied to, let down, disappointed, or undermined by somebody? Most of us have. And perhaps all in one day. Never mind that person now, or the persons who may have done whatever to you. Have you learned the ways that make for peace? Have I? The force field of faith is living in the future today in trust. We can't afford to wait. Been offended? In Luke's gospel, Jesus commands us to talk it out directly with the person who offended us in a spirit of unconditional forgiveness. Jesus calls us to trust the power of faith to do what seems to us to be impossible. If it seems like it'll take a while, as the prophet said, hang in there. Sometimes force fields may take a while before all those little filings get into the right position. The force field of faith is not a badge and it's not magic. When it comes to using faith in our relationships, it's an action which begins with forgiveness, but moves beyond it. We tap into that faith when we remember we are servants of the Master, the source of our own forgiveness and the source of our faith. When we in Love Feast practice the act of service by washing someone's feet, we have the opportunity to strengthen our faith. Symbolically, a sister or brother uses the waters of forgiveness to wash away our soul's infection from our sinful attitudes. And then we kneel to remind ourselves we are called into service of the Master Grace Giver, who was prepared to be tortured, abandoned, and to die for the sake of the things that make for peace. We are reminded that living the force field of faith requires no less from us. Now, while Love Feast happens only twice a year, we are called to tap into the force field of forgiveness and faith daily. to trust the shalom of God by living it before it is here in its fullness. Like Olympic athletes, we visualize the community and world we want, and then we do what we can to live our lives in our families, our church, our community, and beyond, in the reality of what we are called to be. Would you pray with me? Gracious Holy One, breathe upon us gathered here. Place your searchlight on our hearts and minds. Use this day to bring us into the faith that is undaunted by mountains of mismanaged relationships or even by trees of terror. As you have forgiven us, help us to forgive ourselves and each other. Help us be aware of our need. Help us be open to the healing you offer. And for this we thank you. Amen.